Thank you, Matt. I think I counted the word unusual 4 times. So I'm not sure what that means. But although, as I came in, a few of you said you're not used to seeing a guy in a collar. Episcopalians wear collars, as do Roman Catholic priests. But I have a beautiful, lovely, blonde wife. And I lived in Lafayette, Louisiana for 5 years, which is heavily Roman Catholic. And usually if I went out by myself, it was always Father this and Father that. Can I help you, Father? And if I went to, like one day I was at Home Depot with my wife, and it was Father this until I took my wife's hand and we were walking it, and suddenly everybody thought we had a scandal in the making. So I also told people I don't, when I'm away from St. Martin's, which is a wonderful place to work. Great people, love the church. We're on the corner of Sage and Woodway. If you've driven by there, you've seen the church. But one way, really the way my wife and I get away is we travel. I mean, that's the best way to do it. If we go out of town, and when you travel, sometimes you meet people. I usually don't tell people what I do. Because if I do, one of two things happens. Either they stop talking and walk away, or they want to tell you everything about their religious history and all the bad things they've done. So I kind of so a few years ago we were in Cancun and didn't tell anybody what we had done, and we're in my wife and I, one of the big jacuzzis when everybody's sitting around talking, and we start talking to this couple. And oddly enough, they're from Houston. And they start saying, well, what do you do? And I thought, well, if I say I'm a priest, that's it. They're going to get out, walk away. And so I said, I'm an independent contractor. And so we talked for a long time and ended up shifting. And then, we got to know them over the next few days. And about day 3, they finally said, really, what is it you do? And I said, okay, so I'm an Episcopal priest. And they went, we thought you were a hitman. So I kind of am a hitman, but I'm a hitman for God. I've been at St. Martin's 15 and a half years, and a big part of that, a big part of my life there was the honor, the real honor of serving all the members of that church, but in particular our 41st president and his lovely wife, Barbara. And I want to share a little bit about this book. I'd like to do a couple of readings from the book. I do have a PowerPoint, but I'm debating not doing that because all you fellas down there won't get to see it, and I would have to describe a lot. But I may do some of it. And Pierce Bush is here. He's become a good friend over the years, in large part because of his grandfather. And you appear in the book several times, Pierce. And when I first came to St. Martin's, I don't think I knew how often President and Mrs. Bush would be part of the life of the church. I didn't know if they would be what we in my business call creasters, Christmas and Easter folk, or if they would be there all the time. But we suddenly learned pretty quickly that church was very important to them. And I think that shaped who they were. I love the name of your group. And I'm grateful for Tom and Matt and others who invited me to come because you're here to kind of learn tools to live your life beyond the door of your office and have the tools to learn how to be a good father, how to be a good husband, how to be a good friend, and how to be a follower. And I really do think that we all ought to be thinking as we make our way through life, what am I here for? There's a difference between being a human doing and a human being. And a human doing is somebody who just does things. I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a father. A human being understands that they have a relationship with our Lord. They were brought here because God wanted you on planet Earth. And you have an obligation to live as God calls you to live. And I think President Bush, and let me say something as I move forward. So Barbara, I eventually called her Barbara, which was hard to do. The first time we were kind of having a personal conversation, I called, it was over the phone. I said, Mr. President and Mrs. Bush, and she said, now hold on. Mrs. Bush was my mother-in-law, and you can call me Barbara, you can call me Barb, but you cannot call me Mrs. Bush. So I kind of swallowed. By the way, the president never said, don't call me Mr. President. So I just called him Mr. President, even when we prayed together, and which was often. But many of you know the history that in September of 1944, President Bush was shot down in the Pacific as he jumped out of the airplane. Two of his comrades were killed in action, never found. Landed in the Pacific, bobbing up and down, and the USS Finback, a submarine, popped up out of the water and rescued him. And I think a lot about this because he was only 19 years old, and think about most 19-year-olds that you know. And his question, as he kind of reflected on that moment for the next several days, because he kind of continued to travel with the Finback, his question was not, I wonder why I made it. It was not, oh, I'm so glad I made it, I'm going to go party now. I can't wait to get back to the U.S., can't wait till the war's over. The question he asked was, why did God spare me? Why did God spare, 19-year-old one, why did God spare me? And many of you have heard that story, it's told a lot, and it's a story I heard him tell. And even in his senior years when he would tell the story, he would wince, because he hated that his buddies were lost. But I really think that was a plumb line for President Bush. And he was reared in the Episcopal Church. Barbara was reared in the Presbyterian Church. After they married, I think there's some significant moments that tell you a lot about who they would be from the beginning. So we all know they had incredibly broad public roles and did so many things for so many others. But I think their toolbox, what they reached into to kind of keep them going through life, actually was their faith. When the war was over, on VE Day, when everybody kind of broke out into the streets to celebrate, and I'm sure the President and Barbara did their own celebration as well. They had just gotten married. But before they celebrated, they sought out and found privately a small church to go offer prayers by themselves, to give thanks for the end of the war, and give thanks for all those who are coming home, and to remember those who would not be coming home and their families. I mean, that's the kind of thing he did. When their daughter, Robin, was battling leukemia, and of course ultimately succumbed to leukemia. The president was in Texas by that time, but every day on his way to work at 6:30 in the morning, he would stop by the church they were attending and privately pray for her. Barbara would say the most intensely spiritual moment she ever had was being with her daughter Robin when she died and combing her hair and just being, and she said, I felt the presence of God in that moment. So you see, and this is all, you see this kind of common thread in who they are and in what they do. And many times when he was in office, he turned to others for guidance and support. He turned to his clergy. He and Billy Graham were very good friends. When he and Secretary James Baker, who's also a member of St. Martin's, made the decision to go in and liberate Kuwait, they actually studied the Augustinian just war theory that was developed by St. Augustine to determine whether a war was just and moral and right. They sought out the counsel of clergy and friends. They brought other people into their life to pray with them. I was in D.C. at the time studying in seminary from 89 to 92. And several of my classmates' spouses actually served on the White House staff, from correspondence to just kind of small jobs. But they said it was not uncommon at all for the president, when he had a major decision, to call anybody, regardless of their rank or station, to come together and pray with him when an important decision had to be made. They would often go over to St. John across the street to share communion. I love the story that was told. It's a story we probably need to hear deep down right now, the time in which we live. But one of my predecessors, Claude Payne, was serving when Vice President Bush was elected as president. And Claude Payne was at a women's luncheon today. By the way, I was supposed to speak at a women's luncheon today, and I punted so that I could be with you. But he was, my wife's at that lunch right now. But I'm telling you, we're going to have Valentine's. Did you know it was Valentine's? Several of you are now looking terrified. It's Valentine's, oh my God. Just found out it's Valentine's. That's okay, we have a present for you to pick up for you as you leave today. My predecessor was in the women's group, and his secretary came in and said, the vice president's on the phone and wants to talk to you, so you go and pick up the phone. And he said, Claude, this is what I'd like to do. Next Tuesday's the election, and I think our chances are pretty good. And if you remember that election, they were very good. He said, but I want to, whether win, lose, or draw, next Wednesday morning, I want to have a church service at at my church at St. Martin's, so that we can come together. And if I lose, then we're going to pray for the person who won and pray for our country. If I win, we're going to give thanks for the fact that we won. Didn't matter to him. The most important thing was he got together with others to pray the day after he was elected, and that service, of course, was held. So what I began to experience when I came to St. Martin's was this incredible faithfulness to the church. So they were there every week, all the time. I love, the president served on our vestry. He was an usher. He served coffee. Barbara was a member of a group. We have the Saintly Stitchers who hand stitch the cushions and the kneelers throughout the church. They were very active all the time. The kids were active at the time when they were growing up there. Really, it was their church for over 50 years. And what I began to see, in fact, Claude Payne had a Bring a Friend to Church Day, and the president brought Margaret Thatcher, was his friend, and when they were having the G8 summit here in Houston. But what I began to see is that the president really wanted other people to know and experience his church. And so after kind of our initial introduction, and this tells you so much about them. Let me ask this question. I love to ask it for Houston people. How many people here met George or Barbara in the public square, right? How many of you, okay, you usually didn't just meet them. How many of you have a story about them? Yeah, because you didn't just meet them. You could see Barbara down at Walgreens pushing her buggy, and if she ran into you, she'd say, so what is this medicine here? And have you tried this? If you were at the Astros game and you happened to pass them, they would talk to you. I mean, everywhere they went, they were really engaged with folks all over the community. But this says a lot about what would become our friendship. So at the time, I was serving in Pensacola, Florida as a rector, and all of my family was east of the Mississippi. And how many of you know Pensacola, Florida? So I was at Pensacola. I could leave my office and be at the beach in 15 minutes. So I thought I had gone there to retire. I was there 5 years, loved it, great church, really thought we were there. And then we got this invitation to start talking to St. Martin's. And as we did, no offense, we just didn't want to come. I mean, did I mention I could get to the beach in 15 minutes? And this is a beach with white sand and blue water. Just for the record. And but those processes are fascinating, and God gets involved, and we were won over, and we're so glad we did. This has been the best place we've ever lived. We've lived in lots of places. This is the longest place we've lived anywhere, and we love Houston. Absolutely love Houston. Love Texas. But the president got wind that we would be leaving family and friends. So one day I was leaving my house, and this is back in 2007, so we didn't all carry cell phones all the time. And I saw the wall ring, and my phone's ringing on the wall, and it said Office of George H.W. Bush. I was actually headed out on a pastoral emergency, and I thought, do you take the call from the president, or do you have the dying person wait? So I took the call from the president, and and I picked up, and Mary Sage, she said, would you hold for the president, please? I was like, yes, of course. And it was so sweet and so genuine. And so we look forward to seeing you, look forward to work. So glad you've taken the job. And then about 2 weeks later, now at that time, all four of our parents were alive. We're down to one now, my father. All four of my parents are alive. Within 2 weeks, he personally wrote a hand note, 2 pages, to each of our parents and said, just want you to know, I know this probably is hard for you, but they're going to love Houston. They're going to love Texas. We're going to take care of them. And we look forward to meeting you. And all those things came true. They really did befriend us. So the story in this book is packed full of all kinds of stories where they, like we had the anniversary of the library, of the presidential library. And this was one of the occasions when the president jumped out of an airplane. And he wanted that event to start with a prayer by his pastor. We had the anniversary of the liberation of Kuwait down at the library. Invited us all down. Wanted that to be started with a prayer. Had the Points of Light Foundation, which Pierce, you were very involved with that service particularly. It had never been hosted in Houston, and the year it was hosted in Houston, Pierce's dad, Neil, who's become a good friend, the president asked both of us to design a worship service to begin the Points of Light Foundation. That we're going to come together and pray for the work of that foundation. So we saw this again and again. And then the other thing I think I was so struck by was that they pulled out of their toolbox was that they were faithful in their worship. They were in church every week. And one of the things that they witnessed to other people is that even, here are two people very busy, and as they got older, they struggled with a lot of illness. And the president went from an upright, very tall, handsome, big man, and then began this battle with Parkinsonian syndrome, which is not quite like Parkinson's. It affects the lower part of your body. But he went from that to a cane, to a walker, to a wheelchair. He never let that stop him from coming to worship his Lord in his church. Barbara had some issues with her back, and she went from walking upright to a cane to a walker, and they came as long as they could until right up at the end. And when they couldn't come, they would want us to come. In the Episcopal Church, I forget we're being filmed, and sometimes I say things that I shouldn't say, but we have communion. I sometimes call it Jesus in a box. So we have communion, and we bring communion to the house. But that became such a sweet, regular moment, and especially when they couldn't come. And normally, almost always, when we got to the end of communion, and we would hold hands and we'd pray, and I would usually anoint their heads with oil, particularly if they were suffering in some way or recovering or whatever. Often the president was in tears at the end. I believe that we grow in grace. If you know your Bibles, there's a moment in which we step into grace and then and understand what we're here for, as I think the president did. But I think we also grow in grace. That's what we're supposed to do. So one of the toolbox that we have to do that, we pray, we go to Bible study, we do what you're doing, we fellowship, we go to church. Those are all things that we do that prepare us for the next life. And I think they're crucial. And what I saw in the President and Barbara was that they grew in grace. In fact, I gave this book to somebody before it came out to read. And this person said, well, let me pause. I'll tell this joke first. So, because it's apropos. So, purely a joke. I told this in church a few weeks ago. For my members who are here, they'll remember this. And as I was telling it, everybody looked really serious. And I finally had to stop and say, this is a joke. So, this is a joke. So, Jack was a reprobate in this town, and he died. And everybody knew him. Everybody hated Jack. Everybody in this little town hated Jack. He fooled around on his wife. He drank too much. He cheated his friends. I mean, he was just a rotten guy, and he died. And his brother comes in to visit with a pastor to plan the funeral. And he says, hey, pastor, I know my brother. Everybody knows him. He's a horrible guy. But, can you just say at one point he was a saint? And the pastor goes, there's no way I can do that. We all know Jack. There's no way I can do this. Well, if you could just drop it in somewhere in the story. He said, I'll think about it. So the funeral starts. He gets up to start. He said, we all know Jack, horrible guy, fooled around on his wife, drank too much, was a horrible businessman. Nobody liked Jack. But, compared to his brother, he was a saint. You can take that. You can take that anywhere. That's it. But so after I gave this book for somebody to read, they actually said to me, you almost make them out to be like they're saints. Well, Christians actually believe that everybody who's a follower of Christ is a saint. So first of all, that's in the Bible, by the way. When Paul writes the early Christians, he calls them saints. But I do think, of all the people I've known and met, served, these two people were about as close as you could get because they grew in grace. And so when we got to the end, they were perfectly ready to go to what was next because they had drawn on those tools throughout their life and it sustained them. Barbara used to say, when all the crowds are gone and the dust settles, the only thing that's left are friends, family, and faith. And so when all life goes away, you don't get into heaven on your resume. You don't get into heaven on your wealth or your power or the people you know. You get into heaven with your faith. And Barbara and the president had no doubt that that's where they were going to go. And you all have heard some of those stories, and I'm happy to respond to some of those if you'd like. And it was incredible. Some people say, so basically got to serve as their priest and pastor for 11 and a half years, and they said, well, what would you say? What would you say that you observed the most? I said, almost every time I was with them, if I left their house, especially if we'd been praying and talking, I said, it made me want to be a better Christian. I was always humbled by them. You never heard them say a nasty word about somebody else. Can you imagine that in today's climate? Even if the other party was winning, the other party was leading, they would always talk about how important it was to pray for those people. There was so let me stop and say why I wrote this book. I wrote it for 4 reasons, and I did not think about writing it until about 2 years after their deaths. So they died in 2018. This book just came out last fall. And I wrote it to honor them. I wrote it to honor their faith. I wrote it to honor our faith, the Christian faith. And I wrote it with the intent, given the climate in which we're living, that maybe people would pick it up and remember what it was like to have leaders who led with decency and dignity and integrity and character and honesty for others. And I think that grew out of their faith. I think that I really do think that grew out of their faith. And I think we and you who lead in this city, you who know powerful people, you play an important role in making a big difference in the way in which our culture can move ahead. There are a lot of studies right now saying that young people are leaving the churches in droves. Part of that was COVID. But I'm pretty much partially convinced that we have a lot of young folks, millennials, and younger, whatever the next group is going to be called. But they're looking at older people who have become complicit in endorsing behavior in our leaders that is ungodly. And they go, if that's what all that stands for, I don't know if it's worth being part of that. And I'm going to read a little bit at the end about that. Let's do a little bit, because I think one of the things I loved about them was their humor. They had a great sense of humor. I keep on my phone the last text I got from Barbara. And one day I went in to see her in the hospital. This was just a few weeks before she left our world and went to be with our Lord. And she was in the hospital, and she had just gotten a new phone. And she thrust it at me, and she said, I can't see anything. Make the letters bigger. And I said, Barbara, I don't think I should be messing with the First Lady's phone. She said, do it. And I said, well, you have an assistant. She can do it. She just kept going, do it. And I said, okay. So I fiddled with it, and I got it done. And I got back home, and that night, she's still at the hospital, so I called her. I texted her, and I said, I'm just checking in to see if you're okay, and, I hope you got your phone working. And the last text I have from her is, when you do the letter P, that's supposed to be the emoji where somebody's sticking their tongue out at you. So that's what I got. She got this really wonderful spiritual text, and she goes, nah. But they had just a great sense of humor. And a lot of that grew out of their incredible humility. And again, I think the president disarmed people with that humor. Those of you who ever were around them at any point where you might have seen her with their dogs, BB and Minnie, right? They had these two little obnoxious dogs. And BB liked to bite people and had bit everybody. Bit Secret Service, you probably got bit. And so one day we were over at the house. We brought communion, and my wife, as we were leaving, my wife, as she does, kind of leans over to kiss the president, which we normally did, and BB just chomped right on her leg. And Barbara goes, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe she did that." And she said, "I've got to see, I got to see your leg." And so my wife goes, "No, I'm fine. We're walking out of the house. She said, I can't let you go till I see your leg." And so my wife lifts up her leg, and big chunk, blood coming down her leg, and Barbara goes, "Oh, I just feel so horrible about that." And I get outside and I looked at her and said, "You just got bit by the first dog." And the next day, my wife is at Memorial. She's a volunteer at Memorial Park, and she's coming home from her time there, and she sees a car pulling away from the house. And she goes in the house, opens the front door, and there's this huge orchid with a note. And she picks it up, and the note says, "Dear Laura, I'm so sorry about the bite, but you look just good enough to eat." And signed BB. So we kept that. So I will share a couple of things, and then I'm happy to take questions. Oh, by the way, This is one of my favorite bumper stickers, but I keep it in my book. It says, "What would Barbara do?" So one of the gifts that we received several times was to go to Kennebunkport several times. The president and Barbara were so wonderful about inviting us, and they would invite our children. So we would go to that beautiful, beautiful place, and it is extraordinarily beautiful. And we kind of had this pattern. If we took the kids, we would land in Boston, and then we would drive about 90 minutes or so to Kennebunkport. And we always had this talk with the kids about manners and yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. I had 2 teenage sons at the time. I'm like, you don't do what you normally do at the house, and don't make those noises. You're just going to be good the whole time. And so they got. But President Barbara had this incredible way of making them feel like they were grandchildren. As soon as we got there, the place is yours. Enjoy yourself. And those of you who have seen it, of course, the real estate location is extraordinary. But the house, I think it's fair to say, is fairly modest. I mean, it's not. It really is. Lots of incredible things happen there. But there's the main house and these other houses that the children have, and like their home here, their house here in just near the church, very modest for a number of reasons, and that says a lot about them as well. But one year, Barbara says, "Well, y'all come up again, and you can bring. In fact, your kids can bring their friends if they want." And I was like, "Oh no, we're not doing." It took us years to train them just to get them to. And well, my son took her up and decides to bring this girlfriend that we did not like at the time. Have you heard this story, Pearson? Oh, well, good, because it's a good one. And so we land, we have the talk, right? And we're having the talk, and it obviously fell on deaf ears to her. And so one of the things we used to say is, when Barbara speaks, you listen, and we pretty much agree with whatever she says. And so we get there, and we get together for drinks before dinner, and we're kind of visiting, and we're there for just a few minutes. And I want you to keep in mind that Neil's daughter, Lauren, had just married into the Ralph Lauren family, right? So we're sitting there, and the girlfriend, who shall remain nameless, and it's in the book, but I don't use her name, and is sitting next to Barbara, and I'm talking to the president, and all of a sudden I hear her arguing with Barbara about how to pronounce Ralph Lauren's name. And Barbara was so sweet about it, and she was like, well, my granddaughter just married into that family, and I know how to pronounce that. And I want to just run across the room and tackle the girl to the floor. And I'm thinking, we are never going to get invited again. This is just a horrible experience. And it continued for a while, and then we got up to dinner. And the next morning, we'd go walk on the beach, and we were all in sweats, and Barbara was in sweats, and the girl shows up in a cocktail dress with pearls, and I'm so like, this is just horrible. All right, so we're at night number 2. I'm just going to read it to you from the book, right? So things are kind of getting bad, but by the end of the evening of the second day after dinner, after everyone was sent off to try and win the sleeping contest, the president would, when he was ready for the dinner to be over, he'd say, we're going to have a little contest, and we're going to find out who goes to sleep first, which meant everybody can leave the table and go to bed now. So we're all sent off to do that. The president headed off to his bedroom, and Barr turned and looked at us, my wife and me, and so the kids left. And she said, why don't you two take a look at the wedding photos from the wedding? And it was on this little table, and we thought, well, that's kind of unusual. This is from the Lauren wedding. We knew how to say Lauren, by the way. And so, and there were some already pulled together in a little photo book sitting on a table between some comfortable chairs in the nearby living room. It was an unusual request, but we always accepted those invitations. The lights began to go out. Barr headed off to bed. As we flipped through the book, Paula, who's housekeeper for a long time, Paula came out of the kitchen. We visited for a little bit. Then she left, and Barr came back into the room, now dressed in her nightgown and robe with slippers. And I suspect Laura and I had some idea of what was coming as she stood in front of both of us, bent over, and whispered clearly, now, what are we going to do about the girl? That's horrible. That's it. We're just... And I said, in part, we were relieved that the cat was out of the bag. We were all thinking the same thing. We just did not know how to bring it up, which was never a problem for Barbara, so she just put it out there. And Laura and I both said, yeah, right, what are we going to do? And Barr gave us some motherly advice at that moment. Well, you can't say anything. You just need to be who you are, let them see that, let it play out. If you say anything, it'll backfire. And then we went on to talk about how difficult it was to be parents of older children. But we said several ways and several times, you can't say anything, was the overriding counsel. Your boy will figure it out anyway. Whatever he decides, you all have to support him anyway. And I said, she was right, of course, as she always was. And then a few days later, she wrote a letter. They're so good about, how many of you got letters from the president or Barbara? So a lot of you they wrote letters all the time. Dear Russ and Laura, this was a little handwritten note. I've thought about, and she puts the name, but I didn't put the name of the book. I've thought about blank a lot. First of all, I should not have even mentioned it. Secondly, coming to visit the former president would be daunting. Your precious son probably did not put her at ease about how relaxed we were. Fall has finally arrived here. We are so lucky to be here and have each other. Do not answer, but I wanted you to know that I've thought about that lovely child. And then she puts, and no buts. And she signed it Bar. But that's just, again, the way they were. And it was lots of humorous moments, lots of fun moments. And there's a whole chapter in the book on humor. I want to see if I can read this little part. Because you're here, Pierce. This is a neat little, one of the things that the president really enjoyed at the end was having people read to him. And so let me say a word about that, and then I want to close out and take some questions. This is about Pierce's father, Neil. That being present with his dad was a chief priority. Among some of 41's favorite reads were the Candace Millard books. The president much enjoyed history, so Neil would read David McCullough's 1776, John Adams, Walter Isaacson's, Benjamin Franklin, et cetera, et cetera. No surprise to know that the president enjoyed reading John Beecham's books, including his book on Thomas Jefferson and his biography of 41. Pierce learned that well from his father and often came over to eat with the president or watch television with his Gampy. And when Dora or Marvin came to town to visit, they would pick up the reading mantle as well. Neil once told me that he believed they read about 15 books to the president during his last season of life. Laura and I were often fortunate to witness the unbridled affection among the family members, but especially between Neil, Pierce, and 41 that fall. I'd been asked to come by and bring communion on the evening of November 6th. By then, the president was spending more time in his bedroom and less in the sitting room. When I arrived and came upstairs, I heard the news was on. It did not occur to me until I got there that the midterm election results were being broadcast by the hour. And when I came in the room, I found Pierce lying in bed beside the president and the two of them talking about the election. It was a precious memory. Pierce, like Neil, would always hug and kiss his grandfather and never leave without saying, "I love you," to which the president would almost always say, "Love you more," which was the last words he actually said to me, which was "love you more." When I took him communion Thanksgiving before he died. Now, my wife and I spent a lot of time with them in those last few weeks of their life, and we talked a lot about the faith. And as I said, I think the president and Barbara were completely ready to go from this life to the next, without question. And one time the president asked me, and I talk about this in the book, he said he had a real tough year. 2012 was a real tough year. And we were sitting alone, and he said, "What do you think heaven is like?" And I said, "Well, we talked about that a little bit." And he said, "Well, I see Robin." And I said, "Yes, sir, you'll see Robin." And he said, "Well, how old will she be?" And I said, "Well, I don't know that, sir." But what struck me about that question was not, will I get to heaven, or is there a heaven? Think I'm going to make the cut, but I just want to know what it's going to be like. So when I get there, I'm kind of prepared. And we talked that through, and I talk about that in the book. The last chapter is actually on what Christians believe about life after death. Tender moments. So, I kind of walk the reader through those last few days for both of them. I will share with you that when I asked the children, the adult children, if I could write the book, they all said yes, but we want to see it first. And so I wrote it, sent it to them, and they all gave their approval. So they know what's in the book and what's out there. In fact, one more funny story before a more serious story. The only time the president, Barbara, came to our house to eat dinner, we had a Veterans Day event at the church, and they came over to the house, and we were all sitting together. And I did not include this story in the book because I thought it was pushing it a little bit. And my wife read it. You've got to tell that story. And I said, well, all right, I'm going to ask the children first. So I did ask the children, can I tell the story about the time your father and Mom were at the house, and we were finishing up, and she got up to walk away, and he bumped one of my clergy, and he went, look. And one of my clergy guys goes, what? And he goes, as Barbara's walking, he goes, look. And my clergy friend goes, what? He goes, still wiggles. So I sent that off to all the children. And Dora, who's very sweet, Dora said, oh, I think it's cute. And Pierce said, oh, I think you got to do it. And Jeb goes, as long as it was Mom he was pointing at. And so, it's like, and I've got that email. So, so they've read this, they know about the book. In fact, I had a hard time doing it because they were so self-effacing and they did not like the spotlight. And I had conversations with several people about that. And I thought, I don't know how to tell this book without using personal pronouns. But I don't want it to come off as about me. And so I sent that to the kids. And Jeb was actually the one who wrote back. They all said, we fully support the idea. But Jeb said, you've got to write it from your perspective because you're the one who saw these things. And it's a story to tell. And so it's not really about politics. It is about their faith and about how their faith carried them to the end of their life and welcomed them to the next part of life. So let me tell you what I think is a beautiful moment. And most of the time, I'm able to get through it. But sometimes I'm not because it's very real and palpable and an extraordinary memory. Where I live, over near the church, 77056 corner of Sage and Woodway, it's not too far from the president, and I'll say this is just an entree. The power, as long as the president lived there, the power hardly ever went out. In fact, during Harvey, it went out for like 10 minutes. So, and I thought, well, it must, and since they've gone to be with our Lord, it goes out all the time. But on the day that Barbara was getting ready to leave this life, the power had gone out, strangely, for hours. Now, 2 nights before, we thought she was dying, and I was called to the house, and we actually had prayers and at the time of death. And Dora comes downstairs and says, Mom's resting. We all really thought she was getting ready to leave us, and she's resting. And I said, well, does she want me to come pray? She said, let me go check. She goes upstairs, comes back down. She said, no, she wants you to stay with Dad. And the president looked at me and said, I want you to go pray with her. I said, yes, sir, you're the president. So I went up, knocked on the door. I said, Bar? And she said, I'm not checking out yet. That's exactly what she said. And I came in, and I said, well, do you want to pray? I'm going to pray with you. And we prayed, and I anointed her head with oil, and we prayed a little bit. And I was walking, I pulled the door to, and she called out again. And I came back and I said, yeah, Bar, what, you need something? She said, yes, just tell him I adore him. And so I went downstairs, sat down with the president, and he said, did she say anything? I said, well, yes, sir. She said, I'm not checking out yet, and tell him I adore him. And then she rallied for a day, like some people do. She got up the next morning, had breakfast, but she began to call friends and family members. And so by the next morning, she had turned the other direction. So that's where we are when I read this part of the story, and then I'll quit. We knew it was close, but did not know when it would be. Jean Becker, who's the president's chief of staff, called and said she had been talking with 43 and felt like we all needed to pray that if this was Bar's time, now was the time also to pray for even more for a peaceful and timely death, not one that lingered on for days. So I went downstairs and I went to the side garden of the house and prayed. I gave thanks for Bar's life and prayed that if it was the time, then let it be the time of peaceful and painless death. Neil came out and joined me. He had been such a constant presence in Barbara's life, especially in these last years, and I could only imagine what he was feeling. I told him I was praying for our Lord to gently receive his mom. Neil did not want to see her leave, but agreed that was the prayer that was needed at the time. We talked a bit, but I went back inside. Giving her steady decline and not wanting on the local power company to set things right, Evan was the chief medical aide to the president, and company decided to bring the president back downstairs. So he was with her all day, except for a few hours. This Parkinsonian syndrome required that he get some massage on his leg every single day to keep the blood flow going. So gone for the massage, then the power goes out. So they have to go get him, take him down some stairs, bring him up some stairs. So he comes back. It took a bevy of Secret Service agents to carry him down 4 flights and up 2 on the other side so he could sit with Barbara until the end. If I heard it once, I heard it 24 times. As he sat there holding her hand throughout the day, he said, "Bar, I love you. I love you, Bar," with such brazen passion and tenderness that it was palpable. At one point when he and she and I were together alone, he looked at me and gently smiled and pointed at her and then pointed toward heaven. "Yes, sir," I said, "that's where she'll be." At 5:30 p.m., the power was still out, and by then Bar's physician had arrived, and both he and Evan told everyone, "We are there. If there's anything you want to say, now is the time to say it." Neil asked me to pray again. I anointed her head with a cross of oil. The president had been holding her hand, as he had been all day. Everyone in the room, all of us, then knelt by her bed. Neil and Maria, Pierce and Sarah Beth, Evan, Neely, Marshall, and I. We all put our hands on her and again prayed the prayers that we had prayed only a few nights before. "Almighty God, look on this your servant lying in great weakness and comfort her with the promise of life everlasting, given the resurrection through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Depart, O Christian soul, out of this world. Into your hands, O merciful Savior, we commend your servant, Barbara. Receive Barbara into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the glorious company of the saints in light." As we prayed, we wept and we held on to one another and we held Barbara. In my entire life, this is one of the few moments where the demonstrable presence of God was as real to me as the pages of the book you're now holding. When I finished with amen, everyone was weeping and telling Bar, "I love you." The doctor was near and Bar took her final breath. "She's gone," he whispered, and the president asked him to repeat it. "She's gone to heaven, Mr. President." The Celtic Christians teach about something they call thin places. Thin places are those times and moments and people and experiences that you have or encounter, and for whatever reason at that juncture, at that meeting point, the line between heaven and earth is so thin it's hardly detectable, if detectable at all. And I will share a few of those thin places with you in this book, and here is one. At the moment that Bar's physician said the second time, "She's gone to heaven, Mr. President," at that very moment, the lights, the power came back on. Wow. In that instant. We were still all kneeling, still all weeping, and Maria lifted her head and looked at me and said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I don't know, but let's just take it for what it is." But now it's time for family and not for those of us who are not. So Evan and Neely, the doctor, and I left and closed the door. We were quietly standing in the hall outside the room, and Pierce opened the door and said, "Russ, he wants you to come in and pray again." So I came in, I knelt in front of the president and by Bar's body, and I placed their hands together, his on top of hers, and I put my hands around both of theirs. I gave thanks for her life. I prayed that God would welcome one of his own. I prayed that God would comfort the president and all that Bar left behind. I thank God for the love and witness of these two and this wonderful family. And when I finished, the president and I both were in tears, but while I was still on my knees, I took his face in my hands, and I said, "Mr. President, she is at peace now. She is in heaven. She is with your parents and her parents. She's with your dear Robin, and you will see her again. And you, sir, will be okay. We will take care of you. We love you. I love you. I love you," he said. And I kissed him on the cheek and stepped back out of the room. It was up to that point the most intense moment of my ordained ministry. God was present and real and there in that moment. And Barbara was home. And home was actually the last word she spoke. Home was the last word she spoke. It's a wonderful, incredible family. How blessed we were to have them here in Houston and to have them show us what it means to be people of integrity and character and decency and those kinds of things. So if you'll allow me, one more little reading right at the end, and then I'll take a question or two. Toward the end of my homily, so I preached it, if you watched, I preached it I planned those services, which was a lot of fun to do, actually, because you have those conversations with the president and Barbara. And Barbara, they were both so humble. I mean, Barbara, at one point, we knew we had to have a visitation for both of them. And Barbara said, "Do we have to? Can't you just stick me like in the chapel and people can come walk by? And we, the staff and the family, we really have to have a visitation. 8,000 came through St. Martin's at her visitation. 12,000 came through at his visitation, which was remarkable. But I preached at those services, and toward the end of my homily from the pulpit in Washington, D.C., I referenced that many people in the public arena, between the day of 41's death and the burial, began to say, this is the end of an era. You remember when you heard that in the press? Instead, I suggested in my homily, which is in the book, that era does not have to end, and perhaps the president's death is actually an invitation to fill the hole his death left behind. There's no question, I think, that politics has always had the propensity to be nasty business. We have, it seems, grown accustomed to histrionic speeches that bear more of a resemblance to a grade school debate than an intellectual exercise of revealing qualities of leadership and statesmanship. And we, religious folk, have, it seems, I just want to pause, folk like me, so I'm including myself, have gotten all too comfortable with candidates and elected leaders who live lives and speak in ways that in no way resemble essential Judeo-Christian principles. And that is to our peril. It's not just to our peril and the peril of our great nation, though I think that's true, but it is a peril to our faith. For me, of course, that would mean the Christian faith. But any time a person of faith embraces, ignores, or in any way endorses brutality, obscenity, and vulgarity as acceptable practices in the public square of politics, it weakens our witness to the world. There are increasing numbers of study that reveal that droves of people who are abandoning organized religion or spirituality altogether. And the reasons given for this exodus vary, but one major reason considered is the apparent inability of adherents to faiths that have been on planet Earth almost since the dawn of civilization to uphold the most basic tenets of those faiths as expressed in the words, to love one another. Now, we are now in a season, and we are still in that season, in our world and culture, and yes, in the arenas of politics and the church, when we hunger for those days that do seem altogether elusive. We are nostalgic for a better day, and as I suggested at the beginning of the book, that nostalgia is not a reflection on the good old days, but a desire to see them return. And I would ask you to consider the current state of our nation's health. Are we in the athletic arena of health and vitality, or the ICU ward headed toward hospice? And an important question for people of faith to ask is this: are we complicit in the decline of culture and the decay of a nation's health when we abandon our central tenets of belief in ethics and morals by being caught up in the elusive web of the culture of personality, a corrupt ideology, or a self-serving movement that only furthers division and distrust between God's children? I think the answer to all of those questions to anyone who's intellectually and spiritually honest is obvious. But we must do more than hope, and what you hold in your hands provides a roadmap. The qualities of character, decency, and integrity are not unattainable, nor should they be abandoned. Take this volume to heart, consider as you read and as you reflect, and as you do, perhaps as we all do, seek to deal with the ache about the way things are and return to the way things that were. George H.W. and Barbara Bush did that, and in doing so, they changed our nation, changed our world, changed all of our lives for the better. They were living points of light. They showed us what it meant to serve and to love. They remind us of what it means to live with dignity, and by God's grace, may we find our way there again and again and again. All right, so there's an amen.
Go ahead. We got time for maybe one question, maybe two, right there, real quick.
Russ, you got to tell them about the Ballroom Literacy Foundation event.
Yeah, so it's April 20th, and that's a big event that Neil and Maria Bush are a big part of, and at the Hobby Center, and this will be one of the books. This year's theme is family, faith, and friends, and so this is one of the books that we featured.
All right.
So,
one more? Yes, right. Yeah.
Just a comment and then something for us. I think all we needed to do was to watch the halftime show at the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, showed where we are as a nation.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's no words for that. before you were around, Russ, there was a time at the church when Pierce was lost during Sunday school, and the Secret Service agents were scurrying around trying to find him. I don't know if you ever heard that story or not. Yeah, the Sunday school class that he was in went somewhere, and the Secret Service agents couldn't find him, and they were scurrying all around looking for him.
Awesome.
It's probably not enough time. You know, if we had a few more minutes, I know that everyone would be amazed at the schedule that you kept for President Bush's funeral.
Yeah.
I mean, here, Washington, back on the train, all unbelievable.
Incredible privilege too, though. Yeah. Hey, so I will stick around. I will stick around. I'll sign books. Let me see again. It's Valentine's Day, and for those of you who forgot, this is a great present for your loved one, or your mom, or your daughter, or something like that. And I think it is their story. It's not my story. And we're so blessed to have known them and have them as part of our community. And I hope you read it and take it to heart and walk away being reminded that you have a role to play as believers in this community, and kind of punching holes in the darkness. If they can do it the way they live their lives, you can too. Yeah.
Hey, another big hand for Russ.
Great. Thank you.